Hello, thank you for joining me, Carter Brothers, for this, our third online class here at Second Pres, looking at C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. I hope you have your book handy and your cup of tea or coffee or beverage of choice, as this week we continue our discussion of Lewis's understanding of evil as expressed through Screwtape. This week we'll look specifically at the power of evil. And once again, Lewis's take may surprise you. We'll also talk about our power against evil, which is helpful, of course, for this Halloween season if you, like me, have been watching all of the horror movies showing around the clock right now. But more importantly, it's helpful given the year we've had collectively. I do think that understanding evil's power and how to respond to it can provide great encouragement during these uncertain and dark times. I've given you a musical spoiler for that discussion, so if you know your classic hymns of the faith, keep humming that tune. We'll be coming back to it later. But first, I want to tie up a loose end from last week's class. In part one of last week's class, we discussed how Lewis solved the fundamental problem of evil, that being how to explain its origin. Despite what many may think, the Genesis writers were not interested in explaining how the snake got into the Garden of Eden, or even trying to explain who or what the snake was or represented. Lewis chose to believe the origin of evil found in the ancient Christian tradition that explained the snake was in fact Satan, the devil, or to be more specific, the Satan, or Ha-Satan in Hebrew, which means the adversary. In fact, Satan is not a name, it's a title. But Lewis was careful to make sure that folks understood what he didn't believe about the devil. Last week, we looked at Lewis's second preface to Screwtape that was written after publishers had started reprinting Screwtape to include not only the original 31 letters from the 1942 edition, but also his essay Screwtape Proposes a Toast, written for the Saturday Evening Post in 1961. In that preface, which we've teased a couple times about the angry Anglican priest who quit his subscription to The Guardian because of all of the erroneous advice Screwtape was giving, Lewis decides to answer several questions that had been asked of him since Screwtape was published. And he writes in the preface, the commonest question is whether I really, quote, believe in the devil, unquote. Now, if by the devil you mean a power opposite to God and like God, self-existent from all eternity, the answer is no. There is no uncreated being except God. God has no opposites. So for Lewis, evil is not some impersonal, omnipotent force, but rather something like us that has been created. For him, it was more precise to talk about the forces of evil, not evil in some capital E evil sense, because it reminds us about our true struggle, or more specifically, what we struggle against. We looked at Paul's letter to the Ephesians, where he also spoke of these forces of evil, saying that we aren't fighting against human enemies, but against rulers, authorities, forces of cosmic darkness, and spiritual powers of evil in the heavens. For Lewis and Paul and Tolkien, who I cannot help but talk about, the forces of evil are not equals or opposites to God, but more closely they are opposite of angels, being some type of heavenly being that rebelled against God. The Satan is typically understood to be an archangel who fell. And it's this point, the fall, that is the loose end from last week that I want to tie up. Because I think it's this impulse to control our own destiny rather than to serve another that may actually be the origin of all evil. As Milton put in Lucifer's mouth in Paradise Lost, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Quick aside, you won't be surprised to learn that while Lewis was writing Screwtape, he was also working on a preface to Paradise Lost. Here's another point of connection between Lewis and Tolkien. Both men wrote probably the most famous literary criticisms for two of our greatest works of literature. Lewis wrote his for Paradise Lost, and Tolkien wrote his about Beowulf. But that's another class. Back to the fall. It's this question, what causes us to rebel against serving God, that is the most important question from last week's class that you have to decide for yourselves. You can either go the literalist route, believing that these forces of evil we experience each day are fallen angels, or you can view devils as figurative symbols or metaphors for explaining these forces of evil. As Lewis told us last week, ultimately, the choice you make is one of opinion, it's not creed. But Lewis did go the literalist route on this question. And for him, the forces of evil were fallen angels that rebelled and separated themselves from God. And Screwtape tells us they want us to separate ourselves from God also. Misery loves company. That was the second video in last week's class, identifying this characteristic of evil, that evil's purpose is not to scare us or to harm us or to make us despair, although Screwtape does describe those things as rewards of evil's labors. No, evil's purpose is to separate us from God. Well, with that out of the way, let's jump right in and discuss what Screwtape tells us about the power of evil. In letter 9, Screwtape, I keep doing that. In letter 9, Screwtape continues to discuss his spiritual law of undulation by explaining to Wormwood how to exploit the patient's current trough period of dullness and lack of faith. Wormwood thinks the trough is enough, but no, says Screwtape, the aim here is how to use the trough. Screwtape then explains that certain pleasures like sex and drink are quite effective during these trough periods because, as Screwtape writes, the attack has a much better chance of success when the man's whole inner world is drab and cold and empty. Ouch, that hits a bit too close to home for me. Now, perhaps this is more meaningful to men than to women, and that's something I'd love to discuss during our afternoon tea time on All Saints Sunday, because I'm not convinced Screwtape reads the same to women as it does to men, and there are whole letters that I'm not going to bring up for that purpose. And that's something that we can talk about during our tea time on All Saints Sunday from 4 to 5 o'clock. If you wish to participate and you haven't received the Zoom dial-in instructions, email me at screwtapequestions@outlook.com and I'll get that information to you. But back to letter 9. Let's look at the language Screwtape uses in describing these pleasures. Screwtape writes to Wormwood, never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. We know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. It is more certain, and it's better style. To get the man's soul and give him nothing in return, that is what really gladdens our Father's heart. Notice the language that Screwtape uses. The pleasures are God's invention. And notice also the inability of the devil's research department to make or produce one. Lewis is following the theological doctrine of creation ex nihilo. God alone has the power to create ex nihilo, out of nothing. Well, I can't pass up the chance to bring up one of my favorite parts of the Lord of the Rings and talk Tolkien here. Remember, Lewis did dedicate the Screwtape Letters to Tolkien after all, so I feel justified in bringing this up. Do you remember this scene from The Return of the King? Frodo and Sam are making their way through Mordor to destroy the ring, and all they see is waste and desolation. Sauron has destroyed the area around where his forces are camped. And Sam is confused because he realizes there's very little growing here. And he asks Frodo, well, don't orcs, the soldiers of Sauron, don't they have to eat and drink? And Frodo says, yes, of course, because the shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make, not real things of its own. Again, only God has the power to create. Evil can only twist and corrupt and make in mockery of God's power. Well, this isn't a class on Tolkien. This is on Lewis. So let's get back to Screwtape. But again, we see this connection between the power of evil and its limitations. All right. Remember letter 12, which we discussed last week, where Screwtape had said murder, this really wicked sin, is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Well, in letter 12, all right, in our patient's journey, he's become a Christian and then he's fallen away from the faith, and it's sort of backsliding in the language we might use today. And Wormwood writes, what should I do about this during this period of dryness and dullness? And Screwtape writes, as this condition, which is this falling away from God, becomes more fully established, you will be gradually freed from the tiresome business of providing pleasures as temptations. Notice Screwtape saying something that might be surprising to us, because normally we think devils would enjoy tempting with pleasure. That, of course, is how pop culture describes it. But again, the pleasures are God's invention. So it's no surprise that it gets tiresome for the devils. Classic Lewisian humor. I did want to point out in this letter something that Lewis writes about the patient, and says that it's during this time of dryness and dullness of faith that the patient is almost begging Wormwood to distract him from prayer. I wonder if you've ever felt that way. Again, the power of the Screwtape Letters is not just our understanding of evil, but also the way Lewis captures our own experiences sometimes. And that's something we can talk about more during the tea time discussions. All right. Well, this is as good a time as any to talk briefly about pop culture's fascination with evil. So often, the forces of evil are portrayed as suave and cool and attractive. Think Hannibal Lecter, especially in the later sequels. But Lewis is revealing to us that all that is garbage. Evil is actually banal and common, and it's forced to use things like pleasures to attract attention. And it's no wonder Screwtape finds that tiresome. It's just reiterating evil's own limitations. Well, speaking of classic Lewisian humor, letter 8 is another letter that's wonderful in so many ways, and we'll revisit it in greater detail next week. But there's a part of this letter that's relevant for today's conversation. All right, letter 8 is the letter where Screwtape first introduces Wormwood to the spiritual law of undulation, something we talked about last week, how we as humans all go through peaks and troughs in our spiritual lives. So Wormwood has written to Screwtape, having, quote, great hopes that the patient's religious phase is dying away. Well, let's look at Screwtape's response. He writes to Wormwood to decide what the best use of it is. And again, it is this period of dullness, this trough that the patient is in. To decide what the best use of the trough is, you must ask what use the enemy wants to make of it, and then do the opposite. Again, we see the limits on the power of evil. It cannot produce the trough itself. That's part of the spiritual law of undulation. Again, something created by God. What evil can do, though, is figure out how to use it. And look at how evil decides. Figure out what God wants to use the trough period for, and then do the opposite. Again, evil can only twist and mock. It cannot make. Quick aside. Note the reverse theological implication in this letter. When you face a trough period, how often do you ask, I wonder how God wants to use this period to draw me closer to God. I've sometimes, though not consistently, unfortunately, even tried to say, God, thank you for this difficult time, for this struggle, for it is a chance for me to learn more about you. And I found that helps reorient my thinking. That's something I hope that can give you encouragement and support, because it certainly has helped me. All right, letter 29. I hope you've had a chance to watch the introductory class where I explained that Lewis was composing and releasing these letters while England was actually going through the Nazi Blitz during World War II. We talked briefly in the last class about the bombings, and in letter 29, which I know is beyond what I asked you to read, but I just want to pull this piece of the letter out. We learned that the patient is now certain that the Germans will be bombing his town. Quick aside, I'm almost through Eric Larson's The Splendid and the Vile, which covers this very time period from May 1940 to May 1941, and Churchill's defiance during the Blitz. It is an amazing book and a wonderful example of leadership during a devastating crisis for a country. Anyway, that's another class. Let's get back to Screwtape. So the patient is convinced that his town's going to be bombed, and Wormwood asks this question: should we aim for cowardice? Should we aim for courage with consequent national pride? Or should we aim for hatred of the Germans? And let's look at Screwtape's answer. Screwtape writes, well, I am afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. Another classic Lewisian satiric wit. But we cannot supply these qualities ourselves. We can only use them as supplied by the enemy. And this means leaving him, and here, quick aside, of course, God is neither male nor female, Jack, but again, that's the custom of the time. I'm trying to avoid using male pronouns when referring to God, and if I do in this class, I apologize. But here, I just want to have a quick aside there, that when the devils are trying to use virtues, it leaves God a kind of foothold in these men whom otherwise we have made most securely our own. It's a very unsatisfactory arrangement, right, Screwtape? But I trust we shall one day learn to do better. Again, there's wishful thinking in hell, just as there is in heaven and earth. So notice again the limitation of evil's power. It cannot supply courage or any virtuous behavior, so it has to twist and misuse courage by producing this overly nationalistic pride or this hatred of the Germans. And it's risky business if it tries, because it's giving God a foothold. Oh, well, says Screwtape, one day we'll learn to do better. Okay, letter 10, in which Screwtape writes about a really solid triumph of evil. Let's see what he's talking about. Well, again, in the plot story, in letter 10, we learn that Wormwood's patient, who's been going through this falling out period with God in his trough, has made some new friends that are known only as a married couple. Notice how the devils don't know anybody's names. They don't care. We'll talk about why they don't care next week. But Screwtape has learned about the married couple, not from Wormwood, but from another devil named Triptweeze, another wonderful name that Lewis creates for all the devils. And we presume that Triptweeze has been assigned to one or both of the married couple. And after reading Triptweeze's dossier about the married couple, Screwtape is very excited, for these are just the sort of people the devils want the patient to know. And he describes them as rich, smart, superficially intellectual, and brightly skeptical about everything in the world, especially faith and Christianity. Remember, the patient is in a trough period. These are his new friends, and they are pulling him further away from God because of their own biases. And the patient is really enjoying his time with the married couple. So let's look at how Screwtape talks about this new friendship. The first thing Screwtape says to Wormwood is to delay as long as possible the moment at which the patient realizes this new pleasure, and of course he's enjoying his time with this new couple, as a temptation. Since the enemy's servants have been preaching about the world as one of the great standard temptations for 2,000 years, this might seem difficult to do, but fortunately they have said very little about it for the last few decades. In modern Christian writings, though I see much, indeed more than I like, about mammon, I see few of the old warnings about worldly vanities, the choice of friends, and the value of time. All that your patient would probably classify as Puritanism. And may I remark in passing that the value we have given to that word is one of the really solid triumphs of the last 100 years. By it, we rescue annually thousands of humans from temperance, chastity, and sobriety of life. Well, what is Lewis telling us about evil now? The patient's enjoying his time with his new friends, and it's producing pleasure, and it's helpful. But there's danger involved, right? They are pushing him further from God because of their own beliefs. And it's Wormwood's job to delay the patient's realization of the risk. Evil's power in this case is to distract, to delay the patient's understanding. And notice what's the real triumph? How evil has changed the patient's understanding of a word, in this case, Puritanism, from a positive to a negative. And we certainly in our current political climate have seen other words that are often twisted and misused, and that should be a warning to us all. All right, letter 22. We have now reached one of, if not my favorite letter. And it is one of these letters that is indelibly marked in my brain thanks to John Cleese's reading of it. So we're going to listen to the whole thing. Get your book ready, turn to letter 22, have it ready to read along with John. Well, remember how excited Screwtape was of the patient's friendship with the married couple? Let's see what happens when the patient meets someone who is not Screwtape's kind of people. And to make matters worse, the patient falls in love with this person. I'm not going to provide the whole text for the letter. Follow along in the book. That will be more enjoyable for you. And I'll just focus on the parts that are relevant for this week's discussion about the power of evil, which by now you realize, I hope, is actually quite limited. So let's listen to John.
Letter 22. My dear Wormwood, so your man is in love, and in the worst kind he could possibly have fallen into, and with a girl who does not even appear in the report you sent me. You may be interested to learn that the little misunderstanding with the secret police, which you tried to raise about some unguarded expressions in one of my letters, has been tided over. If you were reckoning on that to secure my good offices, you will find yourself mistaken. You shall pay for that, as well as for your other blunders. Meanwhile, I enclose a little booklet just issued on the new House of Correction for Incompetent Tempters. It is profusely illustrated, and you will not find a dull page in it. I have looked up this girl's dossier and am horrified at what I find. Not only a Christian, but such a Christian, a vile, sneaking, simpering, demure, monosyllabic, mouse-like, watery, insignificant, virginal bread and butter miss, the little brute. She makes me vomit. She stinks and scolds through the very pages of the dossier. It drives me mad the way the world has worsened. We'd have had her in the arena in the old days. That's what her sort is made for. Not that she'd do much good there, either. A two-faced little cheat, I know the sort, who looks as if she'd faint at the sight of blood and then dies with a smile. A cheat every way. It looks as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth and yet has a satirical wit, the sort of creature who'd find me funny. Filthy, insipid little prude, and yet ready to fall into this booby's arms like any other breeding animal. Why doesn't the enemy blast her for it if he's so moonstruck by virginity instead of looking on there, grinning? He's a hedonist at heart. All those fasts and vigils and stakes and crosses are only and more pleasure. He makes no secret of it. At his right hand are with the sort of creature.
Sorry, I just...
Who'd find me
We'll go back.
Cunning! Filthy, insipid little prude, and yet ready to fall into this booby's arms like any other breeding animal. Why doesn't the enemy blast her for it if he's so moonstruck by virginity instead of looking on there, grinning? He's a hedonist at heart. All those fasts and vigils and stakes and crosses are only a facade, or only like foam on the seashore. Out at sea, out in his sea, there is pleasure and more pleasure. He makes no secret of it. At his right hand are pleasures for evermore. I don't think he has the least inkling of that high and austere mystery to which we rise in the miserific vision. He's vulgar, Wormwood. He has a bourgeois mind. He has filled his world full of pleasures. There are things for humans to do all day long without his minding in the least. Sleeping, washing, eating, drinking, making love, playing, praying, working. Everything has to be twisted before it's any use to us. We fight under cruel disadvantages. Nothing is naturally on our side. Not that that excuses you. I'll settle with you presently. You've always hated me and been insolent when you dared. Then, of course, he gets to know this woman's family and whole circle. Could you not see that the very house she lives in is one he ought never to have entered? The whole place reeks of that deadly odor. The very gardener, though he has been there only 5 years, is beginning to acquire it. Even guests, after a weekend visit, carry some of the smell away with them. The dog and the cat are tainted with it, and a house full of the impenetrable mystery. We assert it is a matter of first principles that each member of the family must be in some way making capital out of the others, but we can't find how. They guard as jealously as the enemy himself the secret of what really lies behind this pretense of disinterested love. The whole house and garden are one vast absurdity. It bears a sickening resemblance to the description one human writer made of heaven. The regions where there is only life, and therefore all that is not music, is silence. Music and silence. How I detest them both. How thankful we should be that ever since our father entered hell, though longer ago than humans, reckoning in light years, could express, no square inch of infernal space and no moment of infernal time has been surrendered to either of those abominable forces, but all has been occupied by noise. Noise, the grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. Noise which alone defends us from silly qualms, despairing scruples, and impossible desires. We will make the whole universe a noise in the end. We have already made great strides in this direction as regards the earth. The melodies and silences of heaven will be shouted down in the end. But I admit we are not yet loud enough, nor anything like it. Research is in progress. Meanwhile, you, disgusting little...
Here the manuscript breaks off and is resumed in a different hand.
In the heat of composition, I find that I have inadvertently allowed myself to assume the form of a large centipede. I am accordingly dictating the rest to my secretary. Now that the transformation is complete, I recognize it as a periodical phenomenon. Some rumor of it has reached the humans, and a distorted account of it appears in the poet Milton, with the ridiculous addition that such changes of shape are a punishment imposed on us by the enemy. A more modern writer, someone with a name like Pshaw, has, however, grasped the truth. Transformation proceeds from within, and is a glorious manifestation of that life force which our father would worship if he worshipped anything but himself. In my present form, I feel even more anxious to see you, to unite you to myself in an indissoluble embrace. Signed, Toadpipe, for his abysmal sublimity, Under Secretary Screwtape, TEBS, etc.
There's so much to love about this letter. But think about it. The whole place reeks of that deadly odor. The dog and cat are tainted with it. But we'll revisit that part of the letter again in a later class. For now, I want to focus again on Screwtape's complaint. First, that God is actually vulgar to Screwtape because of God's bourgeois mind. God has filled the world with pleasure, and Screwtape can't stand it. But the key part for us is, of course, that everything for Screwtape has to be twisted before it's any use to us. And therefore, I think it's no surprise that Screwtape turns next to his love of noise. We will make the universe a noise in the end, writes Screwtape. Well, think for a second what noise does to someone. Why is it no surprise that every square inch of infernal space in hell is filled with noise? What's the complaint about too much noise that your father or mother, or perhaps you've made yourself to your children? Please be quiet because I can't think straight. Bingo. Noise keeps us from thinking at all, from recognizing all the twisting and the distracting, the rebranding in today's parlance that the adversary is throwing at us. But we also get a hint how to fight back with one of the things that Screwtape detests the most: music. Remember the tune from the introduction to this class? Well, let's listen to it again, but this time from an arrangement that the Kairos band actually used at the start of the pandemic. It's from a group called Heart Song, and we used it intentionally at the beginning of our live streaming services as a way to remind us that we should not be afraid, because at that moment in time, we really didn't know what was coming our way. So let's listen to this song.
A mighty fortress is our guide, a bulwark never failing, our helper he amid the flight of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. And on earth is not his equal. If we in our own strength can fight, then our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. And you ask who that may be. Christ Jesus, it is He, the Lord of hosts, His name, from age to age the same. And He must win the battle. Then though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed for His truth to triumph through us. Then though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed for His truth to triumph through us. Whoa. If we in our own strength can fight, our striving would be losing.
So, obviously, one of the mighty hymns of faith of Martin Luther, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. A mighty fortress is our God. Well, the key lyric for me and for this class is this one. Though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed God's truth to triumph through us. Well, what Lewis is telling us is that evil's power, if we're still going to call it that, is actually a weakness. It cannot create anything. It cannot produce either pleasures or virtues. It can only take what God has made and twist it in mockery of its intended use by God. What does that sound like? Twisting and corrupting and changing. It sounds like a lie, right? The snake didn't make the apple in the garden. It just lied about the apple, and we believed the lie. This should be no surprise, for Lewis tells us in the original preface to Screwtape to remember, the devil is a liar. This is one of the great insights Lewis and Tolkien have so powerfully illustrated through their great theological imagination. The realization comes with another more significant one for us. We have a weapon against the adversary, and that weapon then is truth. Well, that brings up another ageless philosophical riddle. What is truth? But here we Christians have an advantage because we have the answer. I am the way, the truth, and the life, said Jesus. We have the ability to test what evil is saying by looking to Jesus. And now let's note Luther's language. We will not fear, for God has willed God's truth to triumph through us. Through us. We, you and me, we are participants in this battle. We are invited to play a role. We get to advance God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven by being proclaimers of God's truth in the face of the distortions of the adversary. When we feel challenged or confronted or confused, remember, God does not and will not use lies or the lying liars that use lies. Only evil does that. That is the work of the adversary. Now, praise Jesus that God can redeem liars. I'm one of them. And the lies that we tell. But again, that's a whole nother class. We as the church need to guard and protect the truth. It's no surprise the church is so often challenged in this area. Just the other day, CNN had a story about how this QAnon garbage is going around targeting Christians by using arguments and policy goals that seem virtuous in other contexts. But in this context is simply getting us, the followers of the way, the truth, and the light, to chase obvious lies. Remember how the KKK latched onto the church and the good Christian people of the South. This all sounds oh so very much like Screwtape, doesn't it? Well, I've provided you some music and some thoughts for your battle against the forces of evil this week. It'll be up to you to find the silence in the coming week that is also so deadly to Screwtape. And it's my hope and prayer that though the world seems devil-filled, this class encourages you in your own fight with the forces of evil, that this class motivates you to fight back against those forces as God leads you. And most importantly, that this class helps draw you closer to Christ, who is indeed our mighty fortress. Next class, we'll finish up our discussion of evil by looking at Screwtape's philosophy of hell as we finish up the letters. Now go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And until we meet again, I remain your affectionate brother in Christ, Carter.